Dumb Show by Brian W. Aldiss. Originally published in the December 1956 issue of Nebula magazine, republished the following year in a collection of the author's stories entitled Space, Time, and Nathaniel. Next, in an anthology called Aspects of Science Fiction in 1959, another collection in 1965 called Best Science Fiction Stories of Brian Aldiss, yet another the next year called Who Can Replace a Man, and another in 1971 called Brian Aldiss Omnibus 2. All of these were republished multiple times over the years, and in 2013 the story was included in the 1950s volume of The Complete Short Stories. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Dumb Show. Mrs. Snowdon was slowly being worn down. She had reached the stage now where she carried about with her a square of card on which the word "Don't" was written in large letters. It was kept tucked inside her cardigan, ready to be produced at a moment's notice, and flashed before Pauline's eyes. The ill-matched pair, the grubby girl of 3 and the shabby, elegant lady of 58, came up to the side door of their house, Pauline capering over the flagstones, Mrs. Snowdon walking slowly with her eyes on the bare border. Spring was reluctantly here, but the tepid earth hardly acknowledged it. Even the daffodils had failed to put in an appearance this year. "Can't understand it at all," Mrs. Snowdon told herself. "Nothing ever happens to daffodils." And then she went on to compile a list of things that nevertheless might have happened. Frost. It had been a hard winter. Soil starvation. No manure since the outbreak of hostilities 7 years ago. Ants. Mice. Cats. The sounds. That seemed most likely. Sound did anything these days. Pauline rapped primly on the little brass knocker and vanished into the hall. Mrs. Snowdon paused in the porch, stopping to look back at the houses on the other side of her high brick wall. When this house had been built, it had stood in open fields. Now, drab little semi-detacheds surrounded it on 3 sides. She paused and hated them. Catching herself at it, she tried instead to admire the late afternoon light falling on the huddled roofs. The sunshine fell in languid horizontal strokes, but it had no meaning for her except as a sign that it was nearly time to black out again. She went heavily into the house, closing the door. Inside, night had already commenced. Her granddaughter marched round the drawing room, banging a tin lid against her head. That way she could hear the noise it made. Mrs. Snowdon reached for the "Don't" card, then let her hand drop. The action was becoming automatic, and she must guard against it. She went to the gram wire TV cabinet, of which only the last compartment was now of use, and switched on. Conditions at home were a little better since the recapture of Iceland, and there were now broadcasts for an hour and a half every evening. Circuits warmed. A picture burned in the half-globe. A man and woman danced solemnly without music. To Mrs. Snowdon it looked as meaningless as turning a book of blank pages, but Pauline stopped her march and came to stare. She smiled at the dancing couple. Her lips moved. She was talking to them. "Don't!" screamed Mrs. Snowdon's sudden, dumb card. Pauline made a face and answered back. She jumped away as her grandmother reached forward, leaping, prancing over the chairs, shouting defiance. In fury, Mrs. Snowdon skimmed the card across the room, crying angrily, hating to be reminded of their infirmity, waving her narrow hands. She collapsed onto a music stool, music, that dear, extinct thing, and wept. Her own anger in her own head had sounded a million cotton wool miles away, emphasizing the isolation. At this point, she always crumpled. The little girl came to her delicately, treading and staring with impertinence, knowing she had the victory. She pulled a sweet face and twizzled on her heel. Lack of hearing did not worry her. The silence she had known in the womb had never left her. Her indifference seemed a mockery. "You little beast," Mrs. Snowdon said. "You cruel, ignorant little beast." Pauline replied. The little babblings which would never turn into words, the little noises no human ear could hear. Then she walked quietly over to the windows, pointed out at the sickening day, and began to draw the curtains. Controlling herself with an effort, Mrs. Snowdon stood up. Thank goodness the child had some sense. They must black out. First, she retrieved her "don't" card from behind the ancient 20th century settee, and then they went together through the house, tugging the folds of black velvet across the glass. Now Pauline was skipping again. How she did it on the low calories was a matter for wonder. Perhaps, thought Mrs. Snowdon, it was a blessing to be responsible for the child. So she kept contact with life. She even caught an echo of gaiety herself, so that they hurried from room to room like bearers of good news, pulling blackness over them, then sweeping on the sonic lights. Up the stairs, pausing at the landing window, racing into the bedrooms till new citadels were created from all the shabby darknesses. Pauline collapsed, laughing, on her bed. Seizing her, tickling now and again, Mrs. Snowdon undressed her and tucked her between the fraying sheets. She kissed the girl good night, put out the light, closed the door, and then went slowly round, putting out all the other lights, downstairs, putting all the lights out there. Directly she had gone, Pauline climbed out of bed, stamped into the bathroom, opened the little medicine cupboard, took out the bottle with the label "sleeping pills." Unscrewing the top, she swallowed a pill, pulling a pig's eyes face at herself in the looking-glass as she did so. Then she put the bottle back on its shelf and slammed the little door, hugging to herself this noisy secret. None of these things had names for her. Having no names, they had only missed meanings. The very edges of them were blurred, for all objects were grouped together in only two vast categories, those that concerned her and those that did not concern her. She trailed loudly back to her bed in the silence there was no breaking, making pig's eyes all the way to ward off the darkness. Once in bed, she began to think. It was because of these pictures she stole her grandmother's pills. They fought the pictures and turned them eventually into an all-night nothing. Predominant was the aching picture, a warmth, a face, a comforting. It was at once the vaguest yet most vivid picture, someone soft who carried and cared for her, someone who now never came, someone who now provoked only the water scalding from her eyes. Elbowing that picture away came the boring picture, this tall, old-smelling person who had suddenly become everything after the other had gone. Her stiff fingers, bad over buttons, her slowness about the stove, her meaningless marks on cards, all the dull mystery of who she was and what she did. The new picture, the room down the road where Pauline was taken every morning. It was full of small people, some like her in frocks, some with short hair and fierce movements, and big people walking between their seats, again with marks on cards, trying with despairing faces to make them comprehend incomprehensible things by gestures of the hand and fingers. The push picture, something needed, strange as sunlight, something lost as laughter. The pill worked like a time bomb, and Pauline was asleep where only the neurosis of puzzlement could insidiously follow. Mrs. Snowdon switched the globe off and sank into a chair. They had been showing a silent film. The latest scientific advances had thrown entertainment back to where it had been in her grandfather's young days. For a moment she had watched the silent gestures, followed by a wall of dialogue. Jean. Then you knew he was not my father, Dennis? Dennis. From the first moment we met in Madrid. Jean. And I swore none should ever know. Sighing, Mrs. Snowdon switched the poor stuff off and sank down with a hand over her forehead. TV merely accentuated her isolation, everyone's isolation. She thought mockingly of the newspaper phrase describing this conflict, the civilized war, and wished momentarily for one of the old, rough kind with doodlebugs and H-bombs. Then you could achieve a sort of Henry Moorish anonymity, crouching with massed others underground. Now your individuality was forced onto you, till self-consciousness became a burden that sunk you in an ocean of loneliness. Right at the beginning of this war, Mrs. Snowdon's husband had left for the duration. He was on secret work. Where? She had no idea. Up till 2 years ago, she received a card from him each Christmas. Then he had missed a year. Then, in the paper shortage, the sending of cards had been forbidden. So whether he lived or not, she did not know. The question now raised curiously little excitement in her. Heartsickness had ceased to be relevant. Mrs. Snowdon had come to live here in her old home with her parents after she had been declared redundant at the university when all but the practical chairs closed down. In the lean winters, first her mother, then her father died. Then her married daughter was killed in a sound raid. Pauline, a tiny babe, had come to live with her. It was all impersonal, dry facts, she thought. You stated the facts to explain how the situation arose, but to explain the situation? Nobody in the world could hear a sound. That was the only important fact. She jumped up and flicked aside an edge of curtain. A rag of dirty daylight was still propped over the serried chimney tops. The more those houses crowded, the more they isolated her. "This should be a time for madness," she said aloud, misting the pain. Something grand and horrid to break the chain of days, and her eyes swept the treble row of old textbooks over her bureau, Jackson's 1890s, Montgomery's early 20th century science fiction, Slade's novelists of the psychological era, Wilson's Zola, Noliben's Wilson, a row of dodos as defunct as the courses of English literature they had once nourished. "Dead!" she exclaimed. "A culture in Coventry," she whispered, and went to get something to eat. "Tough old hag," she told herself. "You'll survive." The food was the usual vibro culture, tasteless, filling, insubstantial. The hospitals of England held as many beriberi cases as wounded. Sound ruled the whole deaf world. It wrecked the buildings, killed the soldiers, shattered the tympanums, and ballooned synthesized proteins of amino acids. The sound revolution had come at the dawn of this new century following 30 years of peace. Progress had taken a new direction. It had all been simple and complete. You just flushed the right electrostatic stress through the right quartz plates, and bingo, you could do anything. The most spectacular result was a global conflict. The powers warred under certain humane agreements. Gas, fission, and fusion weapons were forbidden. It was to be, indeed, a civilized war. VM, vibratory motion, had the field to itself. It learned to expand living vegetable cells 1,000-fold, so that a potato would last for 2 years' dinners. It learned to pulverize brick and metal so that cities could comfortably be turned to a thin dust. It learned to twist the human ear into an echoing, useless coil of gristle. There seemed no limit to its adaptability. Mrs. Snowdon ate her blown-up yeast with dignity and thought of other things. She thought, for lately she had been straining after wider horizons, of the course of human history, its paradoxical sameness and variety, and then something made her look up to the tube over the mantelpiece. The tube was a piece of standard equipment in every home. It was a crude ear designed to announce when the local siren was giving a sound raid alarm. She glanced indifferently at it. The lycopodium seed was stirring sluggishly in its tube. Damp must be getting in. It was not patterning properly. She went on eating, gloomily wondering about the future generations. How much of the vital essence of tradition would be lost through this blanket of deafness? Correct procedure would have been for her, at the stirring of the seed, to collect Pauline and stand out in the open. When the siren went, everyone else left their homes and stood patiently under the bare sky. Then, if the sounds swept their buildings, they would be temporarily smothered by dust as the building vanished, but suffer no harm. Mrs. Snowdon could no longer be bothered with this nonsense. To her mind, it was undignified to stand in the chill air, meekly waiting. If enemy planes circled overhead, she would have had defiance to spur her out. But nowadays there was only the quiet sky, the eternal silence, and the abrupt pulverization, or the anticlimax, when everyone filed sheepishly back to bed. She took her plate into the kitchen. As she came back in the living room, a reproduction of Mellor's Egyptian Girl fell silently onto the floor, shattering frame and glass. Mrs. Snowdon went and stared at it. Then, on impulse, she hurried over to the window and peered out. The encircling houses had gone. Letting the curtain fall back into place, she rushed from the room and up the stairs. She was shaking Pauline before she regained control of herself, and then could not tell whether panic or exultation had sent her scurrying. "The houses have gone! The houses have gone!" Silence, in which the little girl woke sluggishly. Mrs. Snowdon hustled her downstairs and out onto the front lawn, letting a bright swath of light cut across the empty flower beds. Somewhere, high and silent overhead, a monitor might be hovering, but she was too excited to care. By a freak chance, their house stood alone. Around them for miles stretched a new desert, undulant, still settling. The novelty, the difference of it was something wonderful, not a catastrophe, a liberation. Then they saw the giants. Vague in the distance, they were nevertheless real enough, although incredible. They were tall. How tall? 10, 15 feet? More? With horror, Mrs. Snowdon thought they were enemy troops. This was the latest application of the sound. It enlarged vegetable cells. She had the brief idea she had read that human giants could not survive, or were impossible, or something, and then the thought was gone, swept away in fear. The giants were still growing. They were taller than a house now, 30 feet high or more. They began to mop and mow like drunken dancers. Unreality touched her. Pauline was crying. A coolness swept her limbs. She trembled involuntarily. A personal alarm now. Terror because something unknown was at her blood. She raised a hand to her eyes. It loomed away from her. Her arm extended. She was growing. She knew then that the giants were no enemy troops. They were victims. You get everyone out of their houses. One type of VM levels the houses. Another inflates the people, blowing them up like grotesque rubber dummies. Simple, scientific, civilized. Mrs. Snowdon swayed like a pole. She took a clumsy step to keep her balance. Dizzily, she peered at her blank bedroom window, staggering away to avoid falling into the house. No pain. The circuits were disrupted. Only numbness and maniac growth. She could still crazily see the dancing giants. Now she understood why they danced. They were trying to adapt. Before they could do so, their metabolisms burnt out. They sprawled into the desert, giant dusty corpses full of sound and silence. She thought, it's the first excitement for years. Amusedly, before her heart failed under its giant load, she toppled. The don't card fluttered gaily from her bosom, spinning and fluttering to the ground. Pauline had already overtopped her grandmother. The young system was greedy for growth. She uttered a cry of wonder as her head rocked up to the dark sky. She saw her grandmother fall. She saw the tiny fan of sonic light from their tiny front door. She trod into the desert to keep her balance. She started to run. She saw the ground dwindle. She felt the warmth of the stars, the curvature of the earth. In her brain, the delighted thoughts were wasps in a honeypot, bees in a hive, flies in chapel, gnats in a factory, midges in a Sahara, sparks up an everlasting flue, a comet falling forever in a noiseless void, a voice singing in a new universe.